the middle of October 1874, most of the families in Sabin County, Nebraska, were loading wagons. Maren Bagge was plowing a road. Not a field, the road. The public section line that ran east and west past her claim, 2 ruts and a strip of bare ground between them, packed hard by 4 years of freight wagons and cattle and rain. She put her yoke of oxen on it a little after sunrise and turned it over a furrow at a time, the way a woman turns a mattress. When she finished the road, she started on her own dooryard, then the path to the well, then the ground the oxen had stood on all summer, packed to the color and hardness of a fired brick. Her son Anders, who was 11, walked behind with a hoe and broke the clods she left. Her daughter Kirstine, who was 6, followed him and broke nothing at all, but she carried the water jug and she believed she was helping, and nobody told her different. Then came the seed, and there is a small thing about that seed that turns out to be the hinge of everything. The Bagges had kept a rye patch since they filed, 4 acres of it, because they were Danes and they ate rye. It had gone in the ground in the fall of 1873, and it had come ripe in the last days of June 1874. And it was cut and threshed and in the bin 4 weeks before the sky went dark. When the Locusts finished with Sabin County that July, every field in the valley was bare, and the Bagge place had 11 sacks of rye in the house. Nobody made anything of it at the time. There was too much else to look at. Maren made something of it. She sowed winter rye. Not out in the field where a crop belongs, across the dooryard, across the wagon track, up to the walls of the soddy itself, so close that a person coming to the door had to step through it. Her father, Rasmus Torp, who was 66 years old and wanted to go home to Denmark, stood in the doorway and watched her broadcast seed over ground where a house wants nothing growing at all. Now you have to understand what October meant on that ground in that particular year. 3 months earlier, the locusts had come down on the whole valley and eaten it flat in 5 days. Corn, wheat, oats, garden, the leaves off the cottonwoods, the wool off a dead sheep. There was no crop in Sabin County that fall and no money. And the sensible thing, the thing 4 families on that road were doing right then, was to load up whatever the hoppers had not chewed and drive east until the country looked green again. Maren Bagge did not load a wagon. She plowed the road and planted a lawn. That is what they called it, a lawn, something a town woman in Omaha would put in front of a painted house. Dorsey Renner's clerk said it first at the store, and it went from there the way those things go. And inside a month, everybody in the precinct had a name for her. The road plower. She heard it. Of course she heard it. The county was too small for anything else. By the following July, 3 of the men who used that name would be standing in her dooryard with their hats in their hands. Before we go on, if you've got any use for stories about people who got laughed at and turned out to be right, take a second and subscribe. That's all I ask, and it's free. And it's the only thing that keeps stories like this one from getting lost the way most of them did. Go on, I'll hold the door. All right, back to October. The Bagge place was 160 acres of Republican Valley loess, filed on in the spring of 1871 by Peter Bagge, who had come from Jutland by way of a stone quarry in Wisconsin. The house was sod. 2 rooms, a roof of sod laid over cottonwood poles, a window of oiled paper on the south wall because glass had to be freighted and glass cost money. It rained mud for 2 days after it rained water. Everybody's did. They had made it 4 years. Not well, but they had made it. Then the 28th of July, 1874, and after that there was nothing. That winter the relief committee came out from town with a barrel, flour, a little salt pork, a bundle of second-hand coats sent by a church in Ohio. Maren took what they gave her and wrote down what she took, in a school copybook, on the last page, because she meant to pay it back, and she wanted the figure to be right when she did. That was a long winter in a sod house. They burned twisted hay and dried cow chips, there being no timber to speak of on that ground, and the smoke of it got into the wool of everything they owned. Kirstine slept between her grandfather and the wall. When the wind came out of the north, the oiled paper in the south window breathed in and out like something living, and in the morning there would be a fine drift of snow along the base of the wall where it had worked through the sod, and Maren would sweep it out the door before it melted. The turkeys were the only creatures on the place that had a good July. 11 of them, And while the corn went down, they walked the rows all day with their heads swinging and ate until they could hardly get up on the roost, and by August they were the fattest birds in the precinct. Anders had named the old Tom Bishop on account of the way he walked. Bishop had an opinion about everything and gave it freely. Maren sold 4 of the hens in town in November for $2.60, which was every cent of money the Bagge place made in the year 1874. She kept the rest. She had watched them work in July, and she had made a note of it. Peter did not take the coats. Peter walked out to the road and looked east for a long while, and came back in and said the thing men said that winter. There is work on the railroad at Omaha. He left on the 9th of March, 1875, with a carpet bag and 30 cents and a loaf of his wife's bread. One season, he said, he would send for them or he would come back with wages, and either way it would be before the ground froze again. A letter came in June from Omaha. A second came in August from New York, which is not on the way to anywhere in Nebraska. After that, nothing came at all. The county worked it out in its own time and settled on the word that took the least explaining. The Danish widow. It got said in front of her more than once. She never corrected anybody. There was no version of the truth that was easier to carry than that one, and she had a good deal to carry already. The coat he did not take stayed on the peg behind the door. It was still there 6 years later. Nobody in that house ever said one word about moving it. So that was the woman, 33 years old, 2 children, a father who read the ship notices in the Omaha paper the way other men read scripture, 1 yoke of oxen named Bjorn and Mikkel, 11 turkeys, and 160 acres of ground that had been eaten to the dirt, and a thing she had seen in August that nobody else in the county had bothered to look at. Here is what happened, and it took about 4 minutes. The first week of August, after the swarm lifted and went south, everyone in Sabin County was looking up. That was where the trouble had come from. Men stood in their ruined corn with their heads back, watching the sky the way you watch a road a man rode off down. What was left to talk about was the sky. Maren Bagge was standing in her wagon track with a bucket, and she happened to look down. The ground was moving. Not the whole of it. A patch by the gate maybe the size of a door laid flat. Female locusts, dozens of them, and each one had backed her hind end down into the hard dirt and was not going anywhere. They were not eating. They were drilling. She knelt and watched one for a while. Then she went and got the paring knife and dug where the insect had been, and about an inch down, in a little pocket she would not have found in 100 years if she had not seen the animal put it there. She turned up a pod. It looked like a piece of frothy gray rice, curved, no longer than the first joint of her thumb. She counted what was inside it on the blade of the knife, 26. Then she stood up and looked around the yard. The wagon track, the path to the well, the bare packed ring where the oxen stood, the road out front hammered flat by freight. Every foot of open, sun-baked, hard, bare ground on the place, and every foot of it had insects backed down into it, working. Not the plowed field, not the sod, not the shady ground under the wagon. There the dirt was loose or covered, and a female would try it and give it up and move on. They wanted hard ground. They wanted the road. Now, a word about why, because it matters to everything that comes after, and because it was worked out honestly by men who went and looked, and not by anybody guessing. The Rocky Mountain locust laid her eggs with an ovipositor. She could work down about an inch, sometimes an inch and a half, into firm soil. She wanted it firm. Loose dirt caved in on her, and sod she could not get through. She wanted it bare, and she wanted the sun on it, because the pod had to stay dry through the winter and warm early in the spring. Roads, dooryards, stock lots, buffalo wallows, the very places a settled family made hard and kept bare on purpose. She would put down a pod of 20 to 30 eggs in a case of dried froth that shed water like a shingle, and then she would move 8 inches and do it again. And in a bad year, the ground under a wagon road would hold better than 100 pods to the square foot, and all of them would come up in April within a week of each other, hungry and unable to fly. That was the whole of it. That was the entire secret. And it was lying in the open in every dooryard in the county, and it stayed there, because for 3 months the county was looking up. Maren went in the house and wrote the number 26 in the copybook. She did not have any grandmother's letter, and she did not have any book. She was a farm woman from Jutland, with 4 years in the country and no English worth the name. What she had was one afternoon when she happened to be looking at the ground instead of the sky. That is not much of an inheritance. It turned out to be enough. By the last week of October the rye was in, and the yard was a strange sight. Green fuzz, ankle-high, growing right up against a sod wall, and a road out front that had been a road since before the Bagges came and was now a plowed strip a rod wide. There was a reason it was rye, and it was not only what lay under the ground. The Bagges ate rye. Not the pale loaf a Nebraska woman made out of wheat flour, with a little rye thrown in for color. The black, close, damp rugbrod out of Jutland, that a family cuts in slabs a half-inch thick and lives on all winter, and that keeps 3 weeks in a covered crock without going to mold. Maren had baked it in Denmark, and she had baked it in Wisconsin, and she had baked it in the Soddy. When there was no coffee, she roasted rye in the same pan and ground it and made a black bitter drink of it that her father said tasted like a mistake and drank every morning anyway. Wheat was what you sold, rye was what you ate. In a year when nobody in Sabin County had a thing to sell, that difference was not a small one. Orrin Bostwick came down to see about it on a Tuesday. Bostwick had 12 years in the valley, which made him nearly ancient there. And he was the road overseer for the precinct, which meant the section line was his business in a way it was not anybody else's. He was not a fool and he was not unkind. He was a careful man with a real objection, and he had two. He got down off his horse and stood looking at the furrows. That's a county road. Maren said it was on her line and she had turned it in the fall and it would be packed again by spring. He let that go and came to the part he had actually ridden down for. He picked up a handful of the turned loess and let it run out of his fingers, and the wind took most of it before it hit the ground. This soil blows. That was true. That was completely true. Loess broken in the fall and left bare over a Nebraska winter can move in a hard wind, and men who had watched happen had a right to say so. Then he pointed at the green in the dooryard. And rye's a poor man's grain, 40 cents 90. Also true. Every word Orrin Bostwick said that afternoon was true, which is what makes a skeptic worth writing down. The stupid ones do not slow anybody. It is the ones with a real argument who make you sit down at the table at night and go through it again. Maren heard him out. Then she said that the rye would hold the ground she had turned, which was why she had sown it thick, and that she was not raising it to sell. Bostwick waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. She went back to work. He rode off believing what most of them believed by then, which was that grief takes people different ways, and this was one of the ways, and that it would run its course by planting time. Dorsey Renner, who kept the store at Nyland and carried half the precinct on credit through that winter, was less careful about it. When somebody told him at the counter that the Bagge woman had plowed the section line and put a lawn in her dooryard, laughed until he had to set his cup down. She's fixing to mow it in front of a soddy. They laughed with him. It was a hard winter, and there was not much else going. The children caught it at the school, before their mother had a chance to explain it to them. Anders came home over the snow one afternoon in December, red to the ears, and stood inside the door a while before he got it out. They say we plow roads. Maren was at the stove. She said that they did plow roads. She said it evenly, and she did not look up. And after a minute the boy hung his coat on the peg beside his father's and went out for the water, and it was never brought into that house again. Then the winter did what Bostwick said it would do. The wind came in the 3rd week of January out of the northwest and blew 4 days without letting up, and when it quit, the west edge of what she had turned was gone. Not the dooryard, the rye had rooted there and held. The strip along the west line where she had broken ground late, and the seed had not come up thick enough, had moved. 2 inches of it spread out over the snow crust in a long brown fan, and it was not coming back. She stood out there a long time looking at it. Anders came out and stood with her and did not say anything, being 11 and already knowing better. He was wrong about the rye, she said at last. He was right about the wind. What she did about it took the rest of that winter and most the spring. She quit turning any ground she could not seed the same week. On the west line, she left the old stubble standing and worked between it. She stopped plowing the slope up and down and started running her furrows across it, So a wind coming down the line hit ridge, hollow, and lost its temper before it got to the far end. It was slower. It was a great deal slower. She had to do it twice on some ground. And in February Mickle went down. He was the older ox, and he had wintered on locust-cut hay, which is to say on very little. And one morning in the second week he was lying in the shed and would not get up, and by evening he was gone. That left Bjorn, and one ox is not a team. She borrowed a mate from a Bohemian family 4 miles north for 11 days in April, and paid for it with 2 weeks of her own labor at their place in June, and she made those 11 days count in a way that a person with a full team never has to. In the spring of 1875, the relief committee came around again, and this time they brought seed. Spring wheat. Good clean spring wheat, sent out by the State Association, 3 bushels to a family, and it was a genuine kindness, and it was meant well. Almond Trigg, who was clerk of the committee, ticked the names off a list on a plank laid over 2 barrels. Maren asked whether she could take hers in rye, fall rye, in the fall instead of spring wheat now. Trigg told her there was no rye. There was wheat, and it was to go in the ground in April like everybody else's, and he had 41 families to get to before dark. She said she understood, and she took the wheat and she planted it, because you do not throw charity in a man's face, and because the children had to eat something. But she had been counting all winter, and she had come to a conclusion about April that she could not have explained to Almond Trigg in the English she had, and would not have been believed if she could. So in September she rode to a German settlement in the next county with Peter's pocket watch, which he had left behind after all, on the dresser, in a saucer where a man leaves a thing he means to come back for. She traded it, and 11 pounds of goose down, and a promise of labor at threshing, for 3 bushels of winter rye seed and a peck of winter wheat. She got home after dark. Her father was sitting up. Rasmus Torp had been reading the ship notices for a year and a half, and there was a fare to Copenhagen out of New York that he had figured 6 different ways. And he had told her plainly and more than once that this country had already taken her husband and would take the rest of it if she let it. He looked at her empty hands, and then at the sacks, and he knew what had been in the saucer. That was the last of him left in this house, he said. Maren set the seed down by the stove where it would stay dry. It was, she said. Then she got out the copybook and turned past the page where she had written what the relief barrel had cost, and past 26, to the pages she had been keeping since October, 9 numbered places on the farm, and a date and account for each one. The road at the East Line, the last week of September 1875, 51. 9 places. That was the system, and she had settled on it by the first frost. The road at the East Line, the road at the West Line, the dooryard, the wagon track, the ox lot, the path to the well, the bare ring by the woodpile, the south slope of the field, and a patch of unbroken prairie sawed out past the corner, which she kept as a comparison, the way a person keeps one clean rag to judge the dirty ones by. At each place she cut down a square of ground the size of a pane of glass, and went through it on her knees with the paring knife, and counted what she turned up. She did it the last week of every month. She wrote the number in the copybook with the date beside it, in Danish in a small hand, because paper cost money. Most people never counted anything on that frontier. They endured it, and they told each other about it afterward. Maren Bagge counted, and she was the only person in Sabin County who could have told you in the fall of 1875 exactly how much trouble was lying under the roads. The road at the East Line, that September, 51 to the square foot. The prairie sawed out past the corner. Not one. Dorsey Renner heard about the book the way he heard about everything, over his own counter, and he had his joke ready before the man was finished telling it. She's counting eggs all winter, won't hatch a one fewer. That got its laugh. It was not even an unfair thing to say. Counting a trouble does not reduce it, and Renner had a store full of ledgers himself, and knew exactly what numbers were worth, which is nothing at all until the day somebody needs them. March came in warm that year, and it stayed warm, which everybody noticed and nobody liked. Ice went out of the creek 11 days early. Newt Chidester, who ran wolves for the bounty, and was therefore the only man in the precinct who walked all of it, came through in the 3rd week and said a thing at the store that did not get laughed at. He said the ground down on the south road gave under his boot, not mud, something else, He said it crackled. Nobody had an answer for that, so the subject was changed. Out at the Bagge place the turkeys had gone strange. They had free run of the yard, and they had never much cared where they were. But by the middle of March, the whole flock, and Bishop worst of all, had settled on one corner of it and would not be driven off. They worked that ground all day, scratching, striking, swallowing, and going back at it. Anders drove them out twice, and both times they were back before he had the gate shut. Maren went and stood over the spot. It was the ring where the woodpile had sat all winter. She had turned every foot of that farm in October, every foot she could get an ox onto. What she had not turned was what the woodpile was standing on, and what the ox shed floor was standing on, and a narrow strip along the north wall, where the wagon had been parked out of the weather since the day they filed on the place. Bare ground, hard ground, roofed over from the rain, warm on the south side, and never once broken by anything. She had built a wall around the yard and left 3 doors in it. The woodpile came down that afternoon. It took her and Anders 4 days to move it, restack it, break the ground beneath, and go over it twice with a harrow of cottonwood pegs. The ox shed floor she dug out with a spade, 6 inches down, and hauled the dirt off in the wagon and spread it thin on the plowed field where a March wind and a hard freeze could get at it. Kirstine carried the turkeys' water and stayed out of the way, and did not stay out of the way at all. When it was done, Anders stood looking at the corner. There was nothing to see. It was dirt again, the same as it had been. It looks exactly the same, he said. His mother set the harrow against the shed and took her time answering. April will know. The eggs came up on the 21st. They came up everywhere at once, which is the thing about them, and it is worth understanding. A pod that goes into the ground in August sits all winter under a case of dried froth, and it does not hatch on a warm week in February, and it does not hatch when it is ready. It hatches when the soil has taken enough warmth, and since every pod under a given road took the same winter and the same spring, every pod under that road hatches inside about 6 days of the others. What comes out is not a locust that can fly. It is a thing the size of a grain of wheat that can only crawl and eat, and there are millions of them, and they start at the ground they are standing on and go outward. The roads of Sabin County boil. That is the word the men used afterward, and it is the right one. The section lines turn dark and move. Dooryards, stock lots, the packed ground around every barn and every well in the precinct, and out of that ground came the crop of the whole ruined summer before, hatched right where the people lived. Wheat that was 4 inches high on the 21st was gone by the 28th, and it had not come out of the sky. It had come out from under the wagon. At the Bagge place, Maren went out at first light on the 22nd and walked her 9 stations with the book. Rode at the east line, where she had plowed in October and harrowed in March, a few enough to see, not enough to count fast. Dooryard 2 and the rye standing thick over it and the turkeys already at work. Ox lot none. Woodpile ring, which had been 51 to the square foot in September, and which she had opened up and turned 4 weeks earlier. 11. And dying because a pod that is broken out of the ground in March and left on the surface does not survive a hard freeze, and there had been 2. Prairie sod none, the same as always. She wrote it all down. Then she let the turkeys out of the yard and onto the road, and they went down that section line for a quarter mile like 11 small gray officials taking an inventory, and they ate until they staggered. That was the first test, and it happened under everybody's feet, and most of the county was still looking at the sky. The sky came on the 3rd of July. The swarm that year was smaller than the one in 1874, and it did not need to be large. It came over about 2 in the afternoon, and the light went the color of weak tea, and the sound of it was hail that never landed. In 3 days there was nothing green standing in Sabin County. Spring wheat that had survived April went down in an hour. Corn went, gardens went. The willows along the creek were stripped to bark. The Bagge crop had been in the granary since the 29th of June. Here is the second half of what that woman worked out on her knees with a paring knife, and it is a matter of the calendar and nothing else. Winter rye and winter wheat go into the ground in October. They come up, they tiller, they make root through the fall, and they go into the freeze already established. In the spring they are not starting, they are continuing. They head out weeks ahead of anything sown in April, And on that ground in that country they come ripe in the last days of June. Spring wheat was still soft and green on the 3rd of July. Winter rye had been cut, shocked, hauled, and threshed, and it was sitting in a bin under a roof where a locust has no interest in it whatsoever. She had not found a way to keep the insects off. Nobody ever did. She had found a way to be finished before they arrived. 412 bushels of rye, 190 of winter wheat. The rest of the county had none. Orrin Bostwick came down the road on the 9th of July. He got off his horse at the gate and did not tie it. He walked past the woman standing in her dooryard without a word to her, out onto the section line. And he knelt down in the middle of the road in his good coat and dug into the plowed strip with the blade of his pocket knife. He was down there a long while. When he stood up, he had dirt on both knees and a broken egg case in his palm, empty last year's, harrowed out and finished, and he looked at it the whole way back to the gate. Everybody in this county was looking up, he said. Maren said nothing. There was nothing that needed adding. Bostwick turned the case over once more and put it in his coat pocket, which is a strange thing for a grown man to do, and asked her who had taught her to do this. And here is where she gave the answer they repeated in that valley for 30 years. And she gave it flat, the way she said everything, with no idea she was saying anything at all. Nobody taught me. I only looked down. He rode back to town. He was road overseer for the precinct. And in September he stood up at the precinct meeting with a broken egg case in his hand and said that fall plowing of the section lines was going to be the business of every man whose land touched one. And there was some argument about it, and then there was not. By the middle of October 1876 you could stand on any rise in Sabin County and see plowed roads running to the horizon in every direction like the seams of a coat. There was one more thing, and to my mind it is the part of this that matters. Maren Bagge had 412 bushels of rye seed in a year when winter rye seed could not be bought in that part of Nebraska for love or money, and men came out from 3 counties with cash in their hands. The going rate got up over $2 a bushel by the last week of September because there were speculators in Omaha who could read a newspaper as well as anybody. She sold it at 55 cents. That was what she had paid for hers. 43 families got seed that fall at 55 cents a bushel, and some of them did not pay that year and got it anyway. And Dorsey Renner, who carried those same families on his books and knew to the penny what she had left on the table, stopped telling the joke about the lawn. He never said anything else about it either. Some men apologized by going quiet. Before the last of it went out the door, she took down the copybook and turned to the back page, where she had written what the relief barrel had cost the county in the winter of 1874. $9.40 in flour and salt pork and other people's coats, and she put a line through it. She had been carrying that page for 2 years. She never mentioned it to anybody. The county had fed her when she had nothing, and she was not willing to be the only one in Sabin County who came out of the Locust years ahead. That is the whole of the ledger, and there was no other kind of book kept on that place. The hoppers came again in 1877 and did some damage and not much. They were thinner in 1878. After that, for reasons nobody understood then and only partly understand now, the Rocky Mountain locust began to fail all across the West, and within 25 years there was not one left alive anywhere on Earth. So the road plowing outlived the thing it was for. Most of it does. They kept doing it anyway. It was good for the ground. That October the precinct paid Maren Bagge $18 to walk the section lines with the overseer before the plowing and mark the places that wanted it most, and she did it every fall for 11 years. She never held any office and could not have. She walked ahead of the man who did, with the book, and pointed. That is as close as a foreign woman with bad English got to being counted in that county, and it was closer than anybody had any right to expect, and she took it. Her father did not go back to Denmark. He gave up the ship notices sometime in 1877 and took over the counting book in 1879, when her hands got bad, and he kept it in Danish in a hand smaller than hers until the winter he died. The nickname went the way those go. By 1878, the road plower was not a woman anymore. It was a job, and there were 40 of them in the precinct. And boys who were born after the swarm grew up thinking the roads had always been turned over in the fall. the way you think the fence was always there. In October of 1881, Maren Bagge sat down at the table and wrote the first letter she had written in 6 years. It went to an address in Copenhagen that a cousin had sent on, and it was short because she had spent the 6 years finding out she had very little to say. She wrote that the children were well. She wrote that Anders was 18 and had 80 acres of his own on the North Line. She did not write anything about the watch. She sent a 2-pound sack of rye seed with it, which cost more to ship than it was worth, and on the paper wrapped around the sack she wrote 3 words, "Planted in October." No answer ever came. She had not expected one. Some things you send because the sending is the part that was yours to do. The coat came off the peg that same fall. A family named Sorensen came into the precinct in November with a broken wagon and nothing much else. And Maren took the coat down and folded it and put it in the box with the flour and the salt pork and closed the lid and carried it out to the wagon herself. Now I have thought about this one a good while, and what stays with me is not the 400 bushels. It is the 4 minutes in August when a woman set down a bucket and looked at her feet. Everybody in that valley had the same information she had. It was in their dooryards. It was under their boots every hour of every day, and it stayed a secret for 3 years, not because it was hidden, but because the whole county had agreed on where to look. That is how most of what we do not know gets to stay unknown. Somebody points at the sky and we all point at the sky, and the answer sits in the dirt being stepped on. I do not know that there is a lesson in it beyond the plainest one. Look down once in a while. The ground you are standing on is generally the part of the trouble you can actually reach. This story is true-to-life fiction. Maren Bagge, her family, Sabin County, and every other person and place named here are creative inventions, and any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental.